The morning of June the 6th, 1944, was cool, dark, and grey, an appropriate backdrop to one of the bloodiest episodes of the Second World War in the West. That morning, thousands of anxious, seasick men, loaded with weapons, battle dress, and ammunition, waited their turn to climb down rope ladders into an angry, boiling ocean, a sea in which the fragile and small Higgins boats seemed to be completely ill-suited. Their objective was the liberation of France. The Atlantic Wall stood in their way. Along with elements of the 1st Infantry Division, several thousand men of the 29th Infantry Division's 116th Regimental Combat Team left their ships and departed into the gloomy morning twilight. Their destination was Normandy, a picturesque stretch of French coastline that would be the final resting place of thousands of young American men. In fact, they were heading for one of the worst bloodbaths of the Western Front, Omaha Beach. Amongst the many men making that wet, bumpy journey that morning was 51-year-old Brigadier General Norman Daniel Cotter. Nicknamed Dutch, Cotter was an expert in amphibious operations. He had, in fact, been largely responsible for developing Allied amphibious doctrine, which had greatly influenced the amphibious operation he was now a part of. Given this background, in the months prior to the invasion, General Cotter had been selected to act as Assistant Commander to Major General Charles Gerhardt's 29th Infantry, the Blue and Grey Division. Numerous subordinate elements of the division and its attached units had been allocated to the assault at Omaha, including the 743rd Tank Battalion and 5th Ranger Battalion. With so many disparate elements landing at the same time, into what was sure to be a chaotic battle, General Gerhardt was concerned that order on the beach would simply evaporate once men began to die. Even under the most permissive of circumstances, a contested amphibious operation is immensely chaotic, but conducting one within a pre-sighted kill zone, where the 8cm mortar and MG42 covered every square inch of the beach, was, in all probability, likely to generate complete pandemonium. Thus, in order to combat this inevitable level of disorder, Gerhardt dispatched his deputy divisional commander, General Cotter, to take personal command of the division's forces on the beach. Once ashore, he was ordered to form an impromptu brigade containing all of the division's forces on Omaha, a formation which would immediately dissolve once the defences had been cleared. To lead this so-called bastard brigade, Cotter had established a provisional brigade staff of 25 picked officers, many of whom had been borrowed from other divisions and formations. On the evening of June the 5th, Cotter briefed his men thusly. "You must all try to alleviate confusion, but in doing so be careful not to create more. Ours is not the job of actually commanding, but of assisting. If possible, always work through the commander of a group. This is necessary to avoid conflicts, duplications of both orders and efforts." General Cotter left his transport at 6:30 a.m. He boarded an LCVP which was full of a 32-man strong assault platoon. An element of the second wave, this group was scheduled to hit the beach at 7:30. As the small, flimsy landing craft slowly motored towards the beach, it was bracketed by mortar and artillery fire, and if any had doubts as to the gravity of the battle they were headed into, the volume of this fire soon disabused them of such illusions. Indeed, for many on board that little boat, these were their last moments in this world. Dutch may have expected the battle on Omaha Beach to be chaotic, but nothing could have been adequate preparation for the scene of utter carnage that awaited him. As soon as the landing ramp dropped, 3 men were cut down by machine gun fire. The survivors, including Cotter, scrambled to make their way off the weak plywood boat, desperately searching for any cover they could find. As opposed to a well-organized infantry assault, all Cotter could see were small groups of terrified men huddling behind disabled tanks or steel beach obstacles, all of them searching desperately for any respite from the torrential downpour of 8mm fire. The beach at Omaha was particularly challenging for the assault infantry. Because of the extensive use of defensive obstacles and mines, such as Belgian gates, the assault was timed to occur at low tide. However, at Omaha, this meant the assault infantry had to cover 300 meters of exposed beach before reaching the first area of meaningful cover, a small seawall and shingle bank, which was itself as much as 200 meters from the 30-meter high line of escarpments upon which the German defensive complex was situated. This line of elevated high ground, which was only broken by a number of small exits or draws, was nearly ideal defensive terrain, providing the heavily entrenched defenders with elevated machine gun positions all along the beach. Thus, Omaha was a killing field of the first magnitude, one which the Germans had spent years preparing. When Cotter arrived to assume command, he found the two assault battalions pinned virtually at the water's edge. Some elements had progressed a little further inland, but in the face of such withering machine gun fire dominating such open ground, the initial assault rapidly faltered. Unlike the other beaches, at Omaha, the supporting armoured attack badly miscarried. The two assault regiments were supposed to have the support of two full-strength medium tank battalions of amphibious, duplex-drive Shermans, tanks which could float and motor under their own power. These were planned to reach the shoreline just before the landing craft, allowing the assault infantry to have immediate armoured support. But on the morning of June the 6th, the weather was so bad that one battalion decided to not even attempt deploying any of its DDs. The other put some 29 into the water. Many of these Shermans immediately sank like a stone. Others were flooded by large waves, and most of the rest were disabled by defensive fire. In the end, only 2 made it ashore and were actually able to engage the defences. The assault infantry, men who were cold, wet, and seasick, were unceremoniously dumped into this wide-open kill zone, virtually unsupported. The 116th Regiment's 1st Battalion landed at 6:30 a.m. at Dog Green Sector. The unit's historian later recounted its experience once the landing ramps went down at Omaha. As if this were the signal for which the enemy had waited, all boats came under a crisscross of machine gun fire. As the first men jumped, they crumpled and flopped into the water. Then order was lost. It seemed to the men that the only way to get ashore was to dive headfirst in and swim clear of the fire that was striking the boats. But, as they hit the water, their heavy equipment dragged them down, and soon they were struggling to keep afloat. Some were hit in the water and wounded, some drowned there and then, but some moved safely through the bullet fire to sand and then, finding that they could not hold there, went back into the water and used it as cover, only their heads sticking out. Those who survived kept moving forward with the tide, sheltering at all times behind underwater obstacles, and in this way finally made their landings. Within 10 minutes of the ramps being lowered, A Company had become inert, leaderless, and almost incapable of action. Every officer and sergeant had been killed or wounded. It had become a struggle for survival and rescue. The men in the water pushed wounded men ashore ahead of them, and those who had reached the sand crawled back into the water, pulling others to land to save them from drowning, in many cases only to see the rescued men be wounded again or to be hit themselves. Within 20 minutes of striking the beach, A Company had ceased to be an assault company and had become a forlorn little rescue party bent upon survival and the saving of lives. Upon the first moment of its formation, the Bastard Brigade, General Cotter's first battlefield command, was rendered utterly combat ineffective. In fact, it was in the process of being immolated by machine gun and mortar fire. But despite the sheer, shattering horror of a killing field that was Omaha Beach at 7:30 a.m. on the 6th of June, 1944, a scene and situation that reliably wilted the toughest of men, General Cotter stood tall. In the words of his biographer, Cotter's entire 30-year military career, indeed his whole life, had been preparing him for this very moment. Despite the murderous fire that swept the open beach, Dutch got to his feet and began moving inland. Walking tall as 8mm rounds rained down around him, Cotter moved between the beach obstacles and destroyed vehicles, each a little oasis from the withering fire, where small bands of survivors had gathered. Approaching one group, Cotter calmly proclaimed, "Gentlemen, we are being killed on the beach. Let us go inland and be killed." By this equanimous display of leadership and the disdainful rejection of his own personal safety, the general was able to get the attack moving. Little by little, one small band at a time, by these small acts of personal bravery, Dutch got the men of the 29th Division advancing inland. Over and over again, Cotter personally led small groups forward from the waterline to the cover of the seawall, traversing the machine gun-swept kill zone some 10 times in the process. But somehow, the murderous rain of fire spared him. After moving hundreds of men to the seawall, which was about halfway to the shore, Dutch could see that no one had yet left the safety of this perilous morsel of cover. At the front of this mob of shocked men, Cotter found a small group whom he did not recognize. After informing the general that they were elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion, Cotter uttered one of the most famous statements in modern American military history. "Well, goddammit, if you are Rangers, then get up there and lead the way." This is the origin of the term Rangers Lead the Way, which is the current motto of the 75th Ranger Regiment. They did just that, leading the charge to the shoreline. By 8:30, there were now a few hundred men that had actually advanced beyond the seawall and reached the shore. However, this force was held firm, pinned at the base of the escarpment by the combination of heavy enemy fire and a large barbed wire obstacle. Here, at Dog White sector, between the Vierville and Les Moulins exits, the beach was dominated by a line of steep cliffs and escarpments, cut with small, narrow tracks, exits that ran between the German bunkers and machine gun positions. Seeing the attack stalling once again, Cotter ran back to the seawall and found a group of engineers. After leading these men forward to one of the exits, the sappers used a Bangalore torpedo, which is essentially a long tube filled with high explosive, to cut a hole in the wire. As soon as the dust settled, one of the engineers bravely rose to his feet and charged through the gap. Within moments, he was cut down by German rifle fire. Only a few feet away, General Cotter could see the impact this had upon the men. No one else raised their head. Although Cotter had already displayed more than his fair share of gallantry that morning, once again he imposed himself on this most desperate situation. Assuming the role of a sergeant, Brigadier General Cotter drew his pistol, jumped to his feet, and charged through the clearing, screaming at his men to follow. This act of immense personal valor had the desired effect, stinging the battle-shocked troops into action. Again, by some miracle, the German fire missed him. His .45 caliber 1911 in hand, Cotter charged up the slope so quickly that the platoon of infantry he was leading could not keep up. Eventually, as they advanced up the winding trail, they lost sight of their general. Fearing the worst, the men scrambled up the trail behind him, braving heavy enemy fire in the process. When the leading men came around a blind corner, they found Dutch calmly waiting for them, sitting on the side of the hill, spinning his 1911 as though he were Wild Bill Hickok. Thus, he was the first man to exit the Dog White sector of Omaha Beach, and with a cleared lane now available, his men began moving inland, clearing the German pillboxes with submachine gun and grenade. Cotter's calm and assertive command was decisive on Omaha Beach, giving the assault forces a focused direction that the shocking experience of landing had stripped from them. But despite this truly remarkable display of combat leadership, Cotter's longest day was far from over. With the beach defences penetrated and the assault companies now advancing inland, Dutch returned to Omaha. Assuming command of this sector, Cotter spent the next 10 hours moving up and down the beach, directing the endless flow of follow-on forces that, like an incoming tide, inundated Omaha. Ably supported by his staff, Cotter was able to impose order on chaos, making sure that the thousands of men that landed in wave after wave were offloaded efficiently and moved quickly to their assigned sectors. This included liaising with both the 1st and 29th Infantry Division commanders and their staffs. Even by the end of D-Day, Dutch Cotter's actions had become legendary. Undeniably, his calm and decisive leadership at Omaha was essential in preventing adversity from becoming disaster. For his bravery and gallantry, Dutch Cotter was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, although many who were there that day believed his actions merited the nation's highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. In fact, his command of Omaha Beach on June the 6th was so impressive that the 21st Army Group Commander, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, personally awarded Cotter the Distinguished Service Order, one of the highest decorations awarded within the British Commonwealth. But Cotter's Normandy campaign was just getting started. He was awarded the Silver Star for yet more acts of personal gallantry at the battles of Isigny and the Vire River. A few weeks later, Brigadier General Cotter led a task force to capture the critical road bridge at St. Lo, an action in which he was lightly wounded in the arm. After this battle, he was awarded for gallantry yet again, winning the Oak Leaf to his Silver Star. By the end of the Normandy campaign, he was the most highly decorated American officer on the European continent. By August 1944, Norman Dutch Cotter had become one of the United States Army's brightest stars, but his early career had certainly not been a portent of such success. Indeed, Cotter had once been blacklisted, his career seemingly discarded into the dustbin of history. Cotter was a West Point graduate in the All-Star class of 1917. His cohort included Dwight Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, Mark Clark, Joseph Collins, and Matthew Ridgway, names that certainly need no introduction. Cotter's early career had been stained by an incident in 1922. While he was serving in the Army's finance department as post financial officer, $40,000 was stolen. Although Dutch was cleared of any suspicion, he was held responsible for the theft and the lax security within the office. In a particularly draconian punishment, Cotter was ordered to repay the money, an almost impossible task given $40,000 amounted to approximately 15 years' salary for an Army captain. Although a petition to Congress alleviated the requirement that he repay the debt, this episode badly hobbled his career. As his more famous classmates rose through the ranks to become colonels and generals, Dutch Cotter spent 13 years at the rank of captain. He was a very mature 42 years old when finally promoted to major. After being treated so unfairly, many men would have rejected the military life, especially as Cotter was forced to watch his contemporaries rise to the highest levels of leadership. But his patience eventually proved wise, as the exigency of war has the tendency to erase the stain of past transgressions, especially for capable and well-trained men. And within 2 years, Cotter rose from the rank of major to brigadier general. Undeniably, it was Bradley's patronage and belief in Cotter, his friend and West Point classmate, that led to Dutch's resurrection, and his outstanding performance in the Normandy campaign was all the validation his supporters could have wanted. Dutch's real opportunity for major command arrived on the 13th of August. The day before, Major General James Wharton, the newly assigned commander of the 28th Infantry Division, had been killed by a sniper whilst visiting his frontline battalions. But one man's unlucky tragedy is often another's good fortune, and Brigadier General Cotter was assigned as the division's new commanding officer. Cotter found his new command in a state of mild disorder. The division's previous CO had just been relieved by the 1st Army commander, General Hodges. Although changing battlefield commanders in the midst of a campaign certainly occurred in the German or Commonwealth militaries, it was, perhaps, more culturally acceptable within the United States Army. The simple truth is, in some cases, men who have shown themselves to be competent officers in exercises and on the training ground do not display the same capability under the immense pressure of battle, and thus replacing these individuals with more capable battlefield leaders may be warranted. However, in the US Army, there was a cultural tendency to hold a commanding officer accountable for not only his own performance, but the performance of the unit as a whole, a level of capability that may well have had far more to do with lower level leadership or how the unit was trained, rather than how it was led from the top. All too often, Corps and Army leadership would attempt to address these more systemic shortfalls by simply relieving division commanders in the hope of finding someone who could whip the unit into shape. Nevertheless, as appealing as this course may have been to an Army commander like Hodges, swapping divisional commanders in the middle of a campaign came at a cost. Not only could this unfairly impact the career of otherwise capable generals, men who could still be of great utility to the Army, but removing a leader from a command group disrupted the relationships which had been built between the division's staff officers or regimental leadership, and thus this could have a noticeably negative impact on efficiency and morale. This is a major reason why other armies were perhaps a little more hesitant to remove battalion, brigade, or divisional commanders in the middle of a battle. General Cotter found just such a state of affairs when he arrived at the 28th Division's headquarters. With only a few exceptions, he found his staff officers to be capable men, but the headquarters was not working as efficiently as it should, and morale had clearly been affected by the abrupt change in leadership. Evidently, the 19 Corps commander, Major General Charles H. Cowboy Pete Corlett, had selected Cotter to lead this division because of his reputation as a commander who both demanded high levels of training and could get things done. But before the new CO could make any meaningful changes, the 28th Division was ordered to the Belgian front. Nicknamed the Keystone Division in honor of its home state, the 28th Infantry had been raised as an element of the Pennsylvania National Guard. The unit had been deployed to France on the 22nd of July, just in time for Operation Cobra. After seeing 3 weeks of combat in the breakout from Normandy and the long pursuit, after which Corps headquarters had become unhappy with its performance, the Keystone Division found itself on the German frontier, arrayed along the southern edge of the Hurtgen forest. Cotter's first taste of battle as divisional commander came in early September. On the 13th, he was ordered to make an attack on the Siegfried Line around the city of Utfeld, about a mile inside the German border. In a 5-day battle, the division hurled itself against the German pillboxes, and despite some critical failures, small but nevertheless substantial progress was made. Eventually, the division captured a significant piece of high ground overlooking the town, the attack's first real moment of success. However, just as this was achieved, General Gero, the 5th Corps commander, called off the attack. It had never been anything more than a major reconnaissance in force, and the First Army lacked the resources to support the new salient on the flanks. This first battle left Cotter with mixed feelings. Despite successfully penetrating the west wall, his division had lost 1,500 men across those 5 days of battle, an experience that earned it the German nickname Der Blutige Eimer, or the Bloody Bucket Division, in honor of its red keystone patch, which looked to the Germans like a red bucket. A week later, the unit was removed from the line, and Cotter spent the next 4 weeks resting his men and training the thousands of replacements that were arriving from the continental United States. Along the Hurtgen front, both sides had spent the 6 weeks following the 9th Division's Vossenack and Schmidt offensive preparing for the next encounter. By late October, General Hodges had been planning the November offensive for over a month. After the abortive first attempt to both break the west wall and clear the Hurtgen forest, American forces in the Aachen sector had spent the month of October preparing a larger, set-piece attack. Hodges' plan envisaged an initial offensive in the Hurtgenwald, which would support the primary drive through the Stolberg corridor, by both protecting its right flank and diluting the limited pool of German reserves. With Montgomery still heavily engaged in the Scheldt estuary, these 2 related offensives, conducted by the 7th Corps around Stolberg and the 5th Corps in the Hurtgen forest, which had recently relieved the 7th in this sector, would be the only major November offensive conducted across the entire Western Front. The 7th Corps attack northeast of Aachen, the primary axis and main effort in the drive to the Rhine, was scheduled to begin on the 5th of November. Thus, Hodges set the start date for the 5th Corps attack at the 1st of November, but stipulated that under no circumstances was the attack to go in any later than the 2nd. Gero was ordered to take and clear the Vossenack, Schmidt, Lammersdorf triangle up to the headwaters of the Rohr, thereby dominating the road network and few lines of communication in the Hurtgenwald, firmly anchoring the 7th Corps' right flank in the process. The key to this entire position, however, was Schmidt. When the newly minted Major General Cotter met with his new corps commanders to discuss the November offensive, he was presented with a highly developed battle plan. The failure of the 9th Division's attack towards Schmidt had clearly made an impression on both Generals Gero and Hodges, and thus the corps commander took it upon himself to ensure that the second attack would not suffer the same mistakes and setbacks. Although the primary unit leading the attack on Schmidt would be the 28th Division, Cotter was heavily supported by a number of additional units. In addition to the typical supporting formations such as 2 armoured battalions, 1 tank and the other tank destroyer, attached to the divisional headquarters was an additional towed anti-tank gun battalion, a 3-battalion-strong combat engineer group, and a chemical mortar battalion. Noting the logistical difficulties the 9th Division encountered when operating in the extremely challenging Hurtgenwald, 47 M29 cargo carriers, a small tracked vehicle comparable to a Bren carrier, were also allocated to the division. As one would expect with no other major operations across the First Army's front, artillery support was plentiful. In addition to the 28th Division's 4 organic artillery battalions, Hodges allocated 8 battalions from both the 5th and 7th Corps to general support, and a further 6 battalions would be provided by the 7th Corps headquarters to conduct preparatory fires. Finally, once the 28th Division had taken Schmidt, this breakthrough would be exploited by a combat command, essentially a brigade strength combined arms battle group of the 5th Armoured Division, a unit that would push on and envelop the west wall defences in the Monschau corridor. General Gero also gave Cotter a number of operational directives that largely determined the shape, scope, and tempo of the attack. These directives went down to the regimental level. In order to mitigate the obvious threat of a German counterattack in this sector, a potential which had almost been realised by Colonel Wegerlein a few weeks earlier, Cotter was ordered to allocate 1 regiment to the northern flank. This force would attack from the northern shoulder of the salient in the direction of the village of Hurtgen. In order to pave the way for the deployment of the 5th Armoured Division, Gero then directed that another of Cotter's regiments clear the major road junctions leading to the Monschau corridor. From a start line on the salient's right flank or shoulder, this 2nd Regiment would attack south, hoping to flank the still intact west wall defences in this sector. Thus, this only left one regiment to seize the primary objective, which was, after all, the foundational reason for launching the attack in the first place: Schmidt and its vital road nexus. These detailed orders left Major General Cotter in a not insignificant state of worry. He had expected to be simply given his operational objectives and left to plan the attack as he and his officers saw fit. Instead, he had been micromanaged to the point where he had very little room for flexibility or initiative. He felt as though he had been given an operational plan and his only job was to execute it. But this was not his only source of concern. The 28th Division would be the only unit attacking across the entire Western Front. It would thus be the German cynosure, capturing their complete attention. Compounding this exposure was a battle plan in which his 3 regiments would attack in 3 separate directions across extremely difficult terrain, meaning that they were not able to provide mutual support. As opposed to a powerful and concentrated thrust, the 28th Division's combat power would be diluted across 3 separate, divergent axes of attack, and the further the 3 infantry regiments advanced, the further they would be from one another. As the 28th Division advanced, it would, in effect, be dividing itself into thirds, leaving each of Cotter's regiments highly vulnerable to defeat in detail. But despite these concerns, there was little Cotter could do to amend the plan. He was a brand new divisional commander, and with heavy-handed superiors at the corps and field army level, he was hardly in a position to challenge these orders. This restrictive plan left Cotter with very few options to overcome the primary obstacles which stood between him and his objectives: the enemy, weather, and terrain. Of that trifecta, in the Hurtgen forest, terrain was always king. In this area, the battle space was defined by steep ridges and deep valleys. The Roa subsidiary streams had cut gorges through the forest, the most important of which was the Little Call River. This stream had cut a precipitous valley that ran right across the 28th Division's primary line of advance, separating the small towns of Vossenack and Schmidt. In fact, the battlefield geometry in this region can best be understood by 3 dominating terrain features, which are these prominent ridges. These features run in a roughly southwest to northeast direction, cutting across the main axis of attack diagonally. In general, the high ground is cleared and settled by small villages, which are separated by steep, heavily forested valleys. The 28th Division start line sat on the edge of the central ridge containing the town of Vossenack, which the 9th Division came close to capturing. Directly to the north of the American salient was the Brandenburg-Bergstein Ridge, the highest in the area, and a position from which the entire Vossenack Ridge was dominated. In essence, unless obscured by fog or covering artillery fire, all American operations on the Vossenack Ridge would be under German observation from this dominating feature. The 3rd ridge is just to the southeast of Vossenack. It is separated from the central feature by the steep Call Gorge and contains the town of Schmidt and, further south, the west wall defences of the Monschau corridor. Although the 28th Division's avenue of approach and start line were covered by thick forest, once the attack began, it would be entering the exposed, open country along the high ground, making its units vulnerable to artillery and large caliber direct fires. Along these ridges run the only roads in the area, which were what made Schmidt valuable. The forest itself was still a defining feature of the battle space. 2 of the division's 3 regiments, the left flank attack towards the Hurtgen Plateau and the right flank attack on the Monschau corridor, would all be fighting in the same hellish, dark sea of green that had nearly broken the 9th Division. Only in the centre, the drive to Schmidt, would the 28th move through areas of more typical open country, before plunging back into the heavily forested valleys. The second major challenge facing the men of the 28th was the weather. November in Western Germany is a cold, rainy time of year, with average high temperatures of 8 degrees Celsius and nearly constant cloud and rain. The winter of 1944 proved itself to be one of the worst on record. As the men of the 28th moved up to relieve the 9th, they marched through a cold, damp drizzle. This gloom seemed to make the forest look even more foreboding, an area which showed the scars of a month of tough fighting. Shell craters, mud, and countless shattered trees revealed the ferocity of the battle which had just occurred. As they reached the front, the men who greeted them were dirty, cold, and tired. They wore scraggy long beards and had clearly not showered in days. The men of the 9th Infantry were more than happy to lead the line. They had spent their time in the meat grinder. As the 28th Division continued preparing for the attack, its intelligence staff still estimated the imposing enemy strength as weak. There were still only approximately 5,000 combat troops manning the West Wall defences in this sector, the same ragtag conglomeration of various Kampfgruppen which had been concentrated under the headquarters of General Schmidt's 275th Division. Despite their small numbers, these men had already shown their worth, and the 275th Division's rather impromptu regimental structure was steadily improving. Perhaps the most important development that Allied intelligence missed was the relief of the 82nd Division, which was holding the line in the Monschau corridor. In the coming days, it would be replaced by a Volksgrenadier Division, giving the Germans an unexpected reserve in close proximity to Schmidt. German intelligence, for their part, had detected the Allied preparations. They knew an attack on Schmidt was imminent and had identified the American division which was now opposing them. German command, from General Schmidt to Field Marshal Model, viewed the Schmidt-Vossenack area as absolutely critical. Not only did these ridges and their roads bar the door to the Rohr dams, but by holding the line here, the Germans could keep the Americans bottled up in the Hurtgenwald, where Allied combined arms tactics and material superiority mattered much less, and the Wehrmacht enjoyed many defensive advantages. Finally, and although this was only known to the very highest levels of German leadership, American possession of Schmidt would also threaten the right flank of the forthcoming Ardennes offensive. Thus, possession of Schmidt was far more important to the enemy than any of the American generals realized. With some foreboding, General Cotter completed his preparations by the 29th of October. He was clearly unhappy with the battle plan which had been given to him, but nevertheless, he dutifully followed it. The first phase of the attack would begin in the northern shoulder of the salient, where Lieutenant Colonel Daniel B. Strickler's 109th Infantry Regiment would advance about a mile over the same ground used by Colonel Wegerlein, with the objective of taking the high ground overlooking the village of Hurtgen, the tree line right on the edge of the Hurtgen Plateau. From this good defensive position, the regiment would form an anchor preventing any other attacks materializing from the north. The southern drive was allocated to Colonel Seeley's 110th Infantry Regiment, which was ordered to clear a nest of pillboxes at Rafflesbrand before continuing south. One of the regiment's battalions formed a small divisional reserve. In the centre, the attack's main effort, one battalion of Lieutenant Colonel Karl L. Petersen's 112th Infantry was ordered to attack from Goemeta through the town of Vossenack to occupy the northeastern nose of the Vossenack Ridge, a position which would protect the regiment's left flank. From here, the remaining two battalions would advance from Vossenack across the Kohl Gorge to take Schmidt. Despite the town of Schmidt being the primary offensive and defensive objective, just 2 of the division's 9 infantry battalions were tasked with taking it, a crystalline example of the lack of concentration which was inherent in Gero's plan of attack. Despite the extensive and well-developed German defensive positions before them, virtually no reconnaissance was conducted prior to the offensive. Indeed, the defenders had hardly been idle since the 9th Division's September attack. Although many of the original West Wall concrete bunkers had been taken in the Goemeta and Reichelskorn sector, the German defenders had spent the last 5 weeks constructing a new line consisting of trenches, minefields, wire obstacles, and hundreds of log bunkers, positions that were almost as defensible as their concrete cousins. In fact, the Hurtgenwald provided so much raw material that the men of the 275th Infantry Division had more than enough timber to recreate a defensive line every bit as formidable as that encountered in early September, with heavily fortified fighting positions arrayed in depth creating an interlocking web of MG42 fire. But notwithstanding these developments, General Cotter and the rest of the divisional staff were happy to largely proceed with the attack without fully developing a reconnaissance picture. Indeed, very few patrols were dispatched to determine the nature of the German defences before them. Instead, the 28th Division simply relied upon the intelligence provided by their predecessors. One of Cotter's most critical early decisions was the selection of the Kohl Trail as the division's main route of supply. This feature had been detected by aerial reconnaissance, and many within the command group simply assumed that this trail, which wound down the precipitous Kohl River Gorge between the villages of Vossenack and Kommerscheid, would be suitable for large-scale foot and vehicular traffic. But, prior to the offensive, no reconnaissance patrol had been dispatched to this area to determine the validity of the aerial photographs. Its utility was simply accepted as an article of faith. Despite these deficiencies of preparation, The men were prepared to leave their foxholes on the 31st of October, but persistent low cloud and rain prevented the significant preliminary air operations from being conducted. Over and above the weather, the Allied tactical air forces were struggling to isolate a battlefield in such heavily forested terrain. The weather showed no signs of improvement on the 1st of November. Cotter was able to gain permission to postpone the attack until the 2nd, but at General Hodges' insistence, no more delays could be tolerated. The attack was going in on November the 2nd. Rain, hail, or shine. This seems to have been a rather strange and impulsive decision made by General Hodges. The primary operational rationale for setting the November 2 start date was the hope that the Schmidt offensive may draw German reserves away from the main effort at Aachen. However, this hope evaporated when the November 5 attack was postponed by another 5 days. Despite this development, Hodges persisted, and the men of the 28th began their attack without air support, a critical force multiplier. If anything, the weather on November the 2nd was worse than the prior 3 days. A cold, misty day with thick, low clouds. Not only did this eliminate virtually any hope of air support, but the poor visibility badly inhibited artillery observation for both the air and the ground. Despite the inhibited accuracy, the preparatory bombardment was, nonetheless, fearsome. It began at H-3 hours. The supporting batteries of the 5th and 7th Corps poured 4,000 rounds into the German defences. 15 minutes before the attack, the indirect fire switched from the frontline positions to targets across the sector. In all, by H hour, the 28th Division supporting artillery had fired no fewer than 7,313 rounds of 105 and 155mm ammunition. This fearsome bombardment obliterated the German outpost line. However, this was thinly manned by design. As soon as it lifted, the men of the 28th left their foxholes and advanced, moving into the dark green sea that awaited them. Acting in accordance with Gero's plan, the attack began on the northern sector. 2 battalions of the 109th Infantry Regiment left their start line and departed into the forest, marching towards the high ground east of the village of Hurtgen. Initially, they met little resistance. The thinly held German outpost line had been obliterated, and the advance was slowed more by disorder and terrain than the enemy. Within the day, the right flank battalion had reached its objective and was looking across the open ground towards Hurtgen. Despite this early success, the attack soon began to stall. Although none of the battalions had encountered a coherent defensive line, it was clear that the Germans were close. Within hours, a chaotic and dispersed battle erupted across the front. Rather than opposing the attack directly, the defenders instead relied upon infiltration. Using the forest as cover, small units ranging from platoons to sections moved around and between the disordered American battalions, often to reoccupy their original fighting positions. Thus, as the 109th Regiment's reserve and administrative elements attempted to follow the assault companies, they were engaged in countless, vicious little firefights, slowing down the attack substantially. The right flank battalion, however, had a far harder time. It had advanced less than 300 yards when it encountered a large and dense anti-personnel minefield, stopping the attack in its tracks. When the engineers moved forward to clear the obstacle, they were heavily engaged by mortar and machine gun fire. Try as they might, the men of the 109th could not find a path through, and by the end of the day they were still held by this obstacle. The next morning, the battalion commander decided to simply bypass the minefield. However, as his companies were moving around its flanks, they were hit by a serious counterattack. 2 company-sized elements, each approximately 200 men strong, attacked the battalion on the right flank. Thinking the situation serious, the battalion commander deployed 2 companies from the minefield to move to their sister battalion support. As well-intentioned as this was, these formations became intermixed with those of the 1st Battalion, and the day ended with considerable disorder. Despite the loss of impetus caused by the minefield and the German counterattack, Colonel Strickler still had a 3rd Battalion in reserve. However, this had already been committed clearing the enemy infantry which had infiltrated between the assault companies and reoccupied their own positions. By the end of the 3rd of November, it was clear that the 109th Infantry Regiment's attack was beginning to stall. They had pushed a mile-wide salient into the German line, focused on the forested edge of the Hurtgen Plateau. However, the Wehrmacht maintained a counter-salient in the regiment's right flank. Strickler had achieved half of his objective, but the expert use of mines, infiltration and counterattack had bogged the regiment down, and despite numerous attempts, Neither the minefield nor the German salient could be cleared. But it was the impact of German artillery that brought the left flank attack to a complete halt. Despite its small volume, the forest drastically amplified the lethality of German artillery fire. With 105mm shells exploding in the trees above them, the Americans began to dig, burrowing deep into the ground to avoid the murderous airbursts. In just 3 days of battle, the front had calcified into a beehive of trenches and foxholes with overhead cover. Any attempt to resume the attack exposed the men to this murderous indirect fire, and casualties quickly mounted. The Hurtgen forest had trapped another American formation. A few thousand meters to the east, at Vossenack, the 112th Infantry Regiment also left their start lines on the 2nd of November. Lieutenant Colonel Theodore S. Hatzfeld's 2nd Battalion attacked east from Germata with the aim of taking the village of Vossenack and securing the northeastern nose of the Vossenack Ridge. The terrain here was far more open, and thus the Americans were able to employ combined arms tactics. The battalion attack went in with a medium tank company in support, and by the end of the day, this force had taken Vossenack and was digging in on its far side. Despite the rapid success of the battalion attack, the men were unnerved by how overlooked their position was. Both the Brandenburg-Bergstein Ridge to their northeast and the Komischite-Schmidt Ridge to the south could clearly be seen above them. Once Vossenack had been secured, the rest of the 112th Regiment made the division's main effort. At noon on the 2nd of November, 2 battalions left their start line and moved through the forest to the south of Vossenack. Their objective was to cross the Call Gorge and take the village of Schmidt a few kilometers ahead. Before entering the canyon, these 2 battalions were engaged by sporadic but heavy small arms fire. With the debilitating MG-42 fire tearing into the assault companies, the advance slowed to a crawl. Despite being the division's main effort, this 2-battalion attack went in without armour or overwhelming artillery support. Although he had not yet seriously committed to the main route, the regiment's commander, Colonel Petersen, clearly decided that this avenue of approach to Schmidt was unlikely to bear fruit. Instead, he decided to move through the 2nd Battalion's position and approach Schmidt from the head of the Vossenack Ridge, and made plans to begin this movement on the 3rd. To the south of the American salient, at Raffensburg, the 110th Infantry began an utterly grueling advance. The forest here was, perhaps, the thickest of the entire sector. It was so dense that the forest floor appeared dark at midday. Shellfire had transformed this foreboding morass into a maze of shattered trees and limbs. Only a few small fire trails gave some respite from the seemingly impregnable bush. The regiment's objective was to clear a bunker complex near Raffensburg, and then to open up a road that moved behind the west wall defences in the Monschau corridor, allowing these positions to be outflanked. However, the Germans had not neglected this weakness, and had spent the last 6 weeks heavily fortifying this area. The battle here most closely resembled the murderous slogging match experienced by the 9th Division a month prior, except now the German defences were even more formidable. The pillbox network, which was the regiment's primary objective, had now been linked with thick layers of barbed wire, mines, and trenches. Where the defenders lacked concrete emplacements, they built log bunkers with overhead cover. These not only dominated the wire and mines, but each other. As soon as the assault companies left their positions, a hailstorm of automatic fire drove them to ground. The increased utilization of automatic weapons, such as the MG-42 in these small fortress battalions, was designed to give them a disproportionate amount of firepower, which was especially useful when defending a prepared line. The combination of withering automatic fire, a rain of 8cm mortar shells, and the confusion of fighting in the deep, dark forest quickly brought the attack undone. The battalions crawled forward and organisation quickly broke down as platoons and companies became intermixed. One actually reached the wire emplacements before it was decimated by mortar fire. Another platoon was advancing when an air-bursting artillery shell struck the formation. 2 of the men were carrying satchel charges. When these were struck by shrapnel, they exploded, wiping out the entire formation. The regiment desperately needed direct fire support, but in the depths of the Hurtgen, no tanks could reach them. As the sun began to set, none of the regiment's objectives had been taken, and decimated small units began trickling back to the regiment's positions. On the morning of November the 3rd, the regiment renewed the attack. But, if anything, this operation was more costly and achieved less. After a day of hard fighting, one company returned to the attack start line with just 42 men. With this disaster on the southern axis, General Cotter decided to reinforce failure rather than success. He made the consequential decision to commit the divisional reserve. A single battalion would move through Vossenac and assault the west wall defences from the rear, thus hopefully gaining some of the 110th Infantry's objectives. However, with this slim reserve committed, Cotter now had no meaningful infantry resources to meet any German counterattack, if one were to materialise. Given the bloodbath witnessed at Ravensburg, it was to General Cotter's surprise that by the evening of November the 4th, the 28th Division had taken possession of Schmidt. It had actually fallen with relative ease. Advancing in single file, the 112th Regiment had moved its 2 assault battalions through the village of Vossenac and down into the steep Col Gorge. As a company of medium tanks that were arrayed on the Vossenac Ridge fired over their heads, smashing the neighbouring village of Commerscheit, Lieutenant Colonel Albert Flood's battalion scrambled down into the gorge, forded the ice-cold Col River, and clambered up the opposite slope. Clearly, the Germans were not expecting an attack from this avenue, as there was only a small, understrength company at Commerscheit. These Germans put up little resistance, and Colonel Flood urged his men on. The Americans swept through the town, and the surprised defenders fell back in disorder. By the afternoon, Schmidt, too, was in their hands. Flood spent the evening deploying his battalion for defence. Although the population was small, Schmidt was still a large village composed of small farms and houses that sprawled across a bald ridge, and a main street with several multi-storey buildings. It was probably too large an area for a single battalion to hold firmly, and thus Flood had to thinly disperse his forces, forming a ring of strong points and outposts, as opposed to a coherent, connected line. Neither tanks nor towed anti-tank guns had made it down the Col Gorge, and it was midnight before the battalion had any anti-armour capability more potent than a bazooka, although this only amounted to a few anti-tank mines. Back at divisional headquarters in the town of Rott, 11 kilometres to the east, the news that Schmidt had fallen with relative ease was met with jubilation. Cotter and his staff celebrated the successful attack by reading the numerous congratulatory messages that poured in from across the whole 12th Army Group front, with nearly every division or corps headquarters dispatching a note of commendation. None in divisional command had expected the battle around Vossenac and Schmidt to proceed so well, and in his own words, Dutch felt as though he were a little Napoleon. But had he known just how precarious his position was in the Col Gorge, the atmosphere may well have been one of nervous trepidation. Although still bogged down in the forest to the north and south, by the morning of November the 5th, the Keystone Division had taken its primary objective. Nevertheless, the 112th Regiment was, in fact, in a highly vulnerable and precarious position. Its 3 battalions were now stretched across a long and narrow salient which pushed some 5 kilometres into German territory. Although the villages of Vossenac, Commerscheit and Schmidt had been captured, and each of these was garrisoned by an infantry battalion, all of these positions were vulnerable to counterattack from multiple directions. Worse, the Col Gorge cut the regiment in half, with 1 battalion and most of the armour on the east bank in Vossenac, and 2 unsupported infantry battalions on the far side at Commerscheit and Schmidt. The Col Trail had been reconnoitred by the armour, but it had been determined that it was so narrow and steep that this route was impassable to heavy vehicles. Until the trail could be improved by engineers, there was little chance of bringing the tanks forward. Therefore, unless these forward positions could be immediately reinforced, any rapid German reaction could spell disaster. Little did General Cotter know that the Germans were already responding to his fortuitous victory. Unbeknown to the Americans, on the night of November the 3rd, the fresh 272nd Volksgrenadier Division had begun relieving the veteran 89th Infantry. This unit had been holding the west wall defences to the south along the Monschau corridor, and one of its regiments, the 1055th, had already withdrawn through Schmidt the night before it fell. 2 of its battalions were now entrenched to the north of the town, whilst the 3rd, which had been cut off by the American attack, was positioned just to its south. Thus, and although the Americans did not know it at the time, through sheer happenstance, there was now an entire German infantry regiment surrounding Schmidt. But unlucky as this turn of events proved to be, an even more unfortunate situation was unfolding at Field Marshal Modell's headquarters. Taking advantage of the lull in Allied activity, on the night of the 2nd of November, just hours before the 28th Division launched its attack on Schmidt, Modell convened a front-wide command and staff meeting. At a castle near Cologne, staff officers and commanders of Army Group B, the 5th Panzer Army, 7th Army, and a number of corps and divisions, including the formation in command of the Hurtgen sector, the 74th Corps, convened to conduct a number of discussions and exercises. Under Modell's direction, the officers present were ordered to conduct a map exercise. The subject of this exercise was a hypothetical American attack at the boundaries of the 7th and 5th Panzer Armies in the Hurtgen area. As the numerous generals vigorously debated the various ways such an attack could be met, a phone call from 74th Corps headquarters informed Modell that the Americans had, in fact, just launched an attack at that very place. The exercise had just become reality. Modell ordered the 74th Corps commander, General Straub, to return to his headquarters and direct the battle. However, he kept everyone else at the meeting and directed them to continue the exercise. Thus, by the most fortuitous happenstance, all of the vast intellectual resources available to the Wehrmacht on the Western Front just happened to be in a room discussing how to best meet precisely the kind of attack General Cotter was in the process of launching. As the attack began, Modell dispatched some modest reinforcements to General Straub, a single Kampfgruppe of the veteran 116th Panzer Division. This unit was ordered to attack the American salient from the north, and was the force encountered by the 109th Infantry Regiment. With the failure of this maneuver, and the attack's growing momentum, Modell decided that more decisive action was warranted. He ordered an entire regimental combat team of the 116th Panzer Division to move to the village of Hurtgen immediately. This was to be followed by the remainder of the division in the coming days. With the American Schwerpunkt now identified as the town of Schmidt, Modell ordered the 89th Division's 1055th Regiment to halt its withdrawal from the Monschau corridor and be ready to counterattack. When the map exercise broke up, the 7th Army commander, General Brandenberger, returned to his headquarters. Modell had now given him both the materiel and intellectual resources to initiate a decisive counterattack. With the entire 116th Panzer Division now under his command, an understrength though still capable formation, and the local reserve available in the form of the 1055th Regiment, the 7th Army was actually in a very strong position in the Hurtgenwald. General Brandenberger ordered the 116th Panzer's CO, General Major Siegfried von Woldenberg, to split his forces. The 16th Panzer Regiment, at that time fielding the strength of a battalion with 20 to 30 Panther and Mark IV tanks, was to move from Hurtgen and reinforce the 1055th Regiment around Schmidt. There, the two units would counterattack the 28th Division, with the objective of retaking both Schmidt and Commerscheid. Simultaneously, the 116th Panzer's 60th Panzer Grenadier Regiment would attack Vossenack. With the heavy mist and rain keeping Allied air forces grounded, these units reached the battlefield in good order on the night of the 4th of November. As the Germans were moving their precious reserves into position, on the other side of the front, General Cotter was committing his only divisional reserve, a single infantry battalion, into the bloody meat grinder to the south of the salient. Now he quite literally had nothing to meet this very dangerous threat. Although the engineers had been desperately trying to open the Call Trail to vehicle traffic, when a Sherman company had tried to move forward to reinforce Schmidt, only 3 actually made it to Commerscheid. 5 were either hopelessly bogged or hit mines, closing the trail to all vehicles. Even the small and nimble M29 Weasels could not pass. Simply put, the 112th Regiment was completely unprepared for the storm that the Wehrmacht was about to unleash upon them. As dawn broke on November the 4th, Schmidt's American defenders were completely unaware of the German regiment that was quite literally surrounding them. At 7:30, the men scrambled to find cover as an unexpected German artillery barrage engulfed the town. The already unnerved defenders were then shocked to see large bodies of German infantry advancing behind their armour. Hundreds of men deployed in assault formation followed what appeared to be a battalion of tanks. Perhaps as many as 30 Panzer IVs and Panthers. All the American defenders had to meet the Panzers were a few bazookas, but as soon as the Germans learned that there was no covering anti-tank gun screen, the Panzers simply stood off to approximately 200 meters and picked off the American foxholes one at a time. Only at one point in the attack was a Panther effectively engaged by this light, man-portable anti-tank weapon. However, the warhead simply bounced off its sloped armor without detonating. As the tanks came on, hundreds of German infantry followed, and the thinly stretched American line soon began to bend. Simultaneously, under the cover of a heavy artillery bombardment, another battalion of the 1055th Regiment attacked Schmidt from the south. The defenders desperately called for indirect fire support, but for some unknown reason, the typically excellent American artillery was slow. By the time really effective defensive artillery fire was brought to bear, German tanks had already broken through the outer defences and were rampaging through the town. The unexpected, well-executed and well-supported attack on Schmidt precipitated what can only be described as a rout. Colonel Flood's battalion was completely unprepared to deal with the German heavy armour, and as the tanks and infantry penetrated their outer defences, communication between the various companies broke down. As the counterattack developed, confusion only mounted, and within hours the organisation, morale and discipline of the battalion fatally fractured. By 11 a.m, the battle was essentially over. Organised resistance had simply melted. The battalion headquarters, including all of its staff officers, had been captured. On their own initiative, small groups of men began withdrawing, falling back to Kommerscheid. Most were so distressed that they could not be compelled to stop there. They kept running through their own positions, down into the Kohl Gorge and across to Wassenack. About 200 were able to be rallied, and these men dug in with their comrades and joined the Kommerscheid defences. One of the 112th Infantry Regiment's 3 battalions had now been routed and was essentially combat ineffective. Its remnants had been folded into Major Hazlitt's battalion at Kommerscheid, and it seemed certain to all that this formation was about to share its sister battalion's fate. It was, after all, just as vulnerable, alone and exposed across the Kohl Gorge. However, Major Hazlitt had one ace up his sleeve. He had Lieutenant Flieg's 3 M4 Sherman tanks. It took some time for the Germans to traverse Schmidt, which was now being flattened by American artillery fire. Nevertheless, by the early afternoon, the Germans came on. When the first attack materialised, it was made in at least battalion strength, and all along the line a vicious firefight developed. Like a fire brigade, Lieutenant Flieg's tank platoon manoeuvred freely. Leaning on the Sherman's speed and mobility, he led his little posse from one hotspot to another. On the right flank, Flieg spotted a very serious penetration. A company-strength combat team composed of 5 tanks, a mix of Panzer IVs and Heavy Panthers, and an infantry company was overrunning the American defences in an orchard to the east of town. After watching a Panzer V literally drive over an American foxhole, Flieg decided to act. Alone, he ordered his Sherman forward to face the mighty Panther. Flieg had the drop on his German opponent, who had not detected the American vehicle. But when he ordered his loader to load an armour-piercing shell, he was informed that there were none in the sponson rack. There were only high-explosive shells immediately available. As he watched the Panther rampage through an American infantry position, Flieg ordered his gunner to open fire anyway. As could be expected, the 75mm high-explosive round exploded harmlessly on the Panther's tough hide. Not only was the German heavy tank completely unharmed, but the beast was now aware of his presence. As Flieg desperately ordered the gunner to find an armour-piercing shell, he watched the Panther swing its turret towards him, the dark, foreboding muzzle now clearly visible. He watched on in horror as it opened fire, thinking the bright muzzle flash may be the last thing he saw on this earth. Miraculously, the round missed. As he screamed at his men to move faster, the loader finally found an armour-piercing shell and slammed it into the breach. For the second time, the Sherman opened fire, but this time the big German cat was badly wounded. The round struck the Panther's main gun, shearing it off. As the German tank withdrew in panic, the loader found another armour-piercing shell. This time, Flieg aimed carefully. The M61 armour-piercing capped high-explosive shell tore into the comparatively thin side armour, penetrating and exploding inside the vehicle. This blow was clearly fatal, bringing the big Panther to a halt. But Flieg was in no mood for mercy, and he ordered his men to continue firing. After 3 more hits, the Panther burst into flames and was abandoned by its crew. Clearly, The presence of even meagre armoured support gave the Commerschite defences a backbone which their comrades in Schmidt lacked. By 4 p.m, the Germans began to withdraw back towards Schmidt. In fact, Lieutenant Flieg's tiny band had performed admirably. By employing speed and manoeuvre, the outgunned Sherman was able to get the drop on several German tanks, accounting for 3 panzers without loss. 2 more were destroyed by bazooka fire and the bomb of a P-47. General Cotter was slow to realise just how precarious his position was becoming. The first report he received from Schmidt was that it had already fallen. Cotter was receiving contradictory reports from Vossenack and Commerschite, and it was now evident that his headquarters did not even have a good understanding of the nature of the front or the position of his units. To rectify this confusion, Dutch directed his assistant division commander, Brigadier General George Davis, to take the assistant operations officer and get to the front, regardless of obstacles, take command, and organise an attack to recapture Schmidt, which was to be launched the following morning. However, once General Davis reached the forward positions beyond Vossenack, he quickly realised the current issue was not retaking Schmidt, but simply holding Commerschite. The 112th Infantry Regiment's position was still extremely vulnerable, which included a deteriorating hold on Vossenack and its surrounding high ground. Although the regiment's 3rd Battalion was holding good defensive ground around Vossenack, this position was dominated by the Brandenburg-Bergstein Ridge, which provided the Germans with excellent artillery observation. This advantage began to manifest when both Army Group B and the 7th Army allocated a number of independent artillery regiments to the 74th Corps sector. As November the 4th wore on, the American positions around Vossenack received a hellacious and persistent pounding. With such good observation, the indirect fire was accurate, heavy, and effective. Furthermore, the American positions were also within the effective range of 12-centimetre heavy mortars deployed on the neighbouring high ground. Colonel Hatsfield's men found moving between the foxholes in daylight a near death sentence, and even when in cover, the bombardment was so heavy that many men were killed by direct hits. With casualties mounting and morale steadily eroding, the companies began rotating the men through the town, with as few as possible stationed up on the exposed ridge. Nevertheless, hour by hour, the combat power of the battalion was being steadily eaten away by the relentless shell fire, and the formation had not yet even been engaged by the Panzer Grenadiers. On the left flank, near the town of Hurtgen, the 116th Panzer Division executed an altogether less impressive counterattack. Following the path of Regiment Wegeline, the 60th Panzer Grenadier Regiment attacked the 109th Infantry east of the Goemete-Hurtgen Highway. This attack was not supported by armour, and was far more easily broken up by defensive fires. But the heavily wooded and hilly terrain in this area favoured infiltration, and within hours, numerous platooned company-sized elements had penetrated the American position. One of these German formations located a battalion command post, killing or capturing 15 men in the process, including most of the battalion staff and the artillery liaison party. But despite these successes, the 109th held firm, and the 60th Panzer Grenadiers withdrew to their start line. The day of battle had certainly gone well for the Wehrmacht. Although American defences had held at Hurtgen and Commerschite, a battalion had been routed at Schmidt and the vital town recaptured. Furthermore, additional German reinforcements were entering the Hurtgenwald. The continued relief of the 89th Division made another of its regiments available for operations in the Schmidt area, the 1056th. Joining this force was the balance of the 116th Panzer Division, the 156th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, which arrived at Hurtgen on the evening of the 4th. The German plan, as formulated by 7th Army Command, was now well formed and adequately resourced. Its objective was to restore the situation which had existed on the opening day of the American offensive. To achieve this, the 275th Division, the force which had held the line at the beginning of the battle, was ordered to hold the flanks of the salient and prevent any further widening of the breach. On November the 5th, General Brunn's 89th Division was ordered to renew the attack on Commerschite. This force was to clear the east bank of the Call with the assistance of the bulk of the 16th Panzer Regiment. In concert with this operation, the 116th Panzer Division was ordered to attack east of the Call. Whilst one regiment engaged the 109th Infantry around Hurtgen, pinning it in place, the balance of the division was ordered to assault Vossenack from the Brandenburg-Bergstein Ridge, and thereby threaten to envelop and isolate the remainder of the 112th Infantry Regiment. The 28th Division was steadily being placed in a vice. Whilst the Wehrmacht was busy preparing the large, coordinated offensive, the American focus was squarely on the Call Trail. It was clear to General Cotter that if he was unable to move armour forward to Kommerscheid, the town could not be held. However, the trail down the precipitous gorge was still blocked to vehicular traffic by 5 disabled tanks. Admirably, their crews did everything they could to save these vehicles, treating their steeds with the love one might expect of a cavalryman of yore. But after a day of trying to extract these tanks, it was clear to many that the most prudent action was to simply abandon them. If they were pushed down the slope, this would open the way for the numerous other tanks available to the 28th Infantry. After all, Cotter still had a further 2 companies of Shermans and a battalion of tank destroyers that were waiting to move forward. Much to their crews' dismay, on the afternoon of the 4th of November, 4 of these tanks were pushed down the steep slope to their doom. With the path open, including the destruction of a large boulder which had blocked the way, a force of 9 M10 tank destroyers of the 893rd Tank Destroyer Battalion and the balance of Captain Hostrup's medium tank company, 6 M4 Shermans, crossed the river. By midday on the 5th, Cotter had a force of 8 Shermans and 9 M10 tank destroyers in Kommerscheid. Even as these desperately needed reinforcements belatedly crossed the Call, the Germans continued to probe the defences. Kommerscheid village sits a little below Schmidt on the ridgeline, meaning that the defenders were under constant German observation. This gave them little choice but to cower in their soaking wet foxholes, as any movement immediately drew German fire. Morale continued to deteriorate as the men's feet began to rot. Lieutenant Flieg's little band continued to save the day. It stopped another German attack by immobilizing a German tank and forcing the others to withdraw. The belated intervention of Allied air power also improved the American position. P-47 pilots claimed 5 tank kills that day, although only 3 in the Schmidt area. In fact, the tardy intervention of Allied air power on the 5th saved an increasingly desperate situation. Even as the armour drove up the gorge, the beaten, cold and battered remnants of the 112th Regiment's 2 battalions were beginning to wilt under the relentless German pressure. But there was precious little General Cotter could now do to rectify the situation. His other 2 regiments were heavily committed on the flanks, and his only divisional reserve was now engaging the bunker complex on the right. As evening approached on the 5th, the situation continued to deteriorate. The American lifeline remained the single-file trail which wound through the Call Gorge. It was the only line of communication linking the 112th Regiment with the rest of the 1st Army. But, despite its vital importance, at that time the trail was not being guarded by anyone, and it seemed to be only a matter of time before the Germans exploited this vulnerability. The first signs of German infiltration into the Call Gorge arose at midnight. An M26 Weasel was towing an anti-tank gun towards the front when it was unexpectedly attacked at the bottom of the gorge. The most vulnerable point was a small bridge across the Call River, which was being constructed by a platoon of engineers. As they worked, these men were ambushed by a German force in company strength. Those who were not killed only survived by vanishing into the forest. The primary aid station for the 112th Regiment was stationed here. This was captured by the Germans, who, after ensuring that all who were inside were unarmed, simply posted a guard. These men were members of the 116th Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, and they now possessed the entire Call Trail with the exception of the wooded area at the top of each side of the gorge. The American forces at Kommerscheid were now cut off and surrounded. Once news of this disastrous situation reached regimental command, the engineer company was ordered to immediately counterattack, although no such manoeuvre was executed. Help fortuitously arrived in the form of Colonel Richard Ripple. As already noted, essentially all of Cotter's infantry reserves had been committed, and thus he was struggling to gather other resources to influence the battle around Schmidt. But despite having no spare infantry units, what he did have was tanks. Cotter formed a task force under the commander of the 707th Tank Battalion. Task Force Ripple looked impressive on paper. A battle group founded upon an infantry battalion of the 110th Regiment, a medium tank company, and a company and a half of tank destroyers. But by the 6th of November, the 110th Infantry was a badly spent force. The battalion was actually composed of just 300 men, most of whom were from the Weapons Company. The task force was almost bereft of assault infantry. This meagre force was all that the regiment could spare. Cotter ordered Ripple to move across the Call Gorge with the aim of counterattacking the Germans and retaking Schmidt. Neither Rippel nor Cotter realized that the Germans had cut the call trail, but by sheer happenstance, this force was now available in Vossenack. Reacting to the new German penetration, the battle group made an attempt to engage the Panzer Grenadiers, but this was hardly ideal tank country. Nonetheless, and despite several vehicles getting stuck, the appearance of the tank destroyers did rout the first enemy force they encountered. However, as the fight grew hotter, Rippel ordered his infantry battalion to flank the Germans through a fire trail. They were heavily engaged during this movement, but were eventually able to cross the river and make contact with friendly forces on the other side. Although he did not know it at the time, Rippel's counterattack had been successful. With this intervention, the Panzer Grenadiers, a battalion which was quite exposed themselves, withdrew along the river, and the Call Gorge was once again in American hands. As the Shermans and Wolverines crested the ridge and entered Kommerscheid, a scene of utter destruction greeted them. The town had been flattened by German artillery, and its defenders huddled deep in their dark, damp holes. As these vehicles moved forward to reach the main defensive line, they were immediately engaged by effective tank fire. The village of Kommerscheid sits a little lower on the ridgeline than Schmidt, which is approximately 1,000 metres away. The German Kampfgruppe was being held at this higher ridgeline by a heavy and constant artillery bombardment. For the moment, this indirect fire was keeping the German infantry at bay. However, it hardly troubled the panzers. The M4 Sherman is probably one of the most misunderstood tanks of the Second World War. The popular conception of the vehicle is heavily influenced by the vivid tales of horrifying encounters with late-war German heavy tanks, where the comparatively thinly armoured and lightly armed Shermans were outmatched. The real fear Allied tank crews had of the dreaded Tiger has undoubtedly shaped our conception of the M4 as an inferior armoured fighting vehicle. Indeed, many of these episodes are mythological, as there was a tendency amongst Allied crews to classify any German tank they encountered as a Tiger. Perhaps a more balanced evaluation of the Sherman, one that takes account of its other virtues such as speed, especially across long distances, reliability, ease of production and ease of field maintenance, would conclude that, despite its reputation, it was actually one of the best tanks of the war, especially when it was employed in the far less glamorous, but much more common, role of infantry support. But there is simply no escaping the fact that in 1944, when the 75mm armed M4 Sherman and M10 GMC, vehicles which were world-leading in 1942, found themselves in a long-range encounter with the big German cats, they were badly outmatched. The Panther was specifically designed to thrive in the kind of long-range tank engagements that were common on the Eastern Front. The combination of its lethal, high-velocity KWK-40 L70 7.5cm main gun, a weapon that could, when firing a composite rigid armor-piercing shell, defeat nearly 150mm of armor sloped at 30 degrees at a range of 1,000 meters, with excellent German optics, gave the Panther a tremendous advantage in open country. These capabilities were only compounded by its excellent frontal armor. Its upper glacis plate was some 80mm thick and sloped at 55 degrees. Task Force Rippel was about to experience the full horror of this inferiority in long-range engagements. As its tanks and tank destroyers moved through the shattered village, they entered a kill zone. Waiting on the ridge above them was a company of Panthers, some sitting in hull-down positions. As artillery harmlessly exploded around them, the Panzers picked off the American tanks one at a time. Vehicle after vehicle was hit by this devastating and accurate high-velocity, large-caliber fire emanating from the dominating ridge above them. Before it had even reached its start line, Task Force Rippel had been torn to shreds. By midday on the 6th of November, only 3 of 9 M10 tank destroyers had escaped destruction, and from the 2 medium tank companies that had reached the battle area, only 6 Shermans were still in the fight. With Task Force Rippel's immolation at the hands of the 116th Panzer Division's Panthers, any hope of retaking Schmidt evaporated. Although the defeat at Schmidt was a severe blow, essentially leading to the complete destruction of an infantry battalion, it had not threatened the fundamental integrity of the division. Despite the heavy losses, the German counterattack was being held at Kommerscheid. Nevertheless, an altogether more dangerous German attack was about to manifest at Vossenack. One of the primary deficiencies of Gero's attack plan was how narrow and insecure the advance of the 112th Infantry Regiment was. The line of communications ran from one battalion position to the next, creating a pencil-like penetration towards Schmidt, with each major position separated by a steep valley which had to be traversed. This made the 28th Division's position akin to a house of cards. If the Germans were to break through at Vossenack, essentially the base of the pencil, a large part of the division would be cut off and destroyed. This made every point along the 112th Regiment's line of advance both vulnerable and critical. Colonel Hatzville's 2nd Battalion, 112th Infantry Regiment, had been holding a blocking position at the head of the Vossenack Ridge since the first day of the battle. It had been a truly horrendous 3 days for the men at Vossenack. Despite its defensibility, their position was very exposed. Every move the men made was done under the watchful eye of the German artillery observers on the opposite ridge, and with an exposed American unit so vulnerable, the German gunners made the most of the opportunity. For 3 cold, wet, miserable days, the men of the 2nd Battalion endured the unendurable. The bombardment was heavy, accurate, and nearly constant. It was so well directed that the men were forced to simply huddle in their scratch foxholes, fighting positions that were soon filling with ice-cold water. Even leaving a foxhole to urinate risked almost certain death. Making the situation all the more horrific was a seemingly endless, soaking rain, coupled with daytime temperatures of less than 10 degrees Celsius. In conditions as oppressive as this, it was essential that the men in the front line be rotated to the rear regularly to maintain their physical health, morale, and psychological stability. But with essentially all of the 28th Division's infantry battalions committed to the fight, there was no one to take their place. So the men simply sat for hour after hour, often without sleep, in their freezing wet holes, as German artillery mercilessly pounded them. By November the 4th, it was clear to battalion leadership that the situation was becoming dire. The state of the men was now critical. The reports reaching Colonel Hatzfeld from his company commanders were deeply concerning. The men's nerves had been shattered by this horrific experience. Some openly cried when they were told to return to their foxholes. Others had to be ordered to simply eat something. But despite the steadily deteriorating situation, no one had done a thing to rectify it. Although details of the event are still unsettled, with different accounts across various sources, it seems clear that what occurred on the morning of November the 6th was a curious episode of mass psychology and panic. Apparently, that morning, the Germans altered their artillery fire plan. As opposed to the customary dawn bombardment, the guns kept silent. This seemingly unnerved the men who were obviously expecting an attack. When the bombardment resumed, it did so with particular fury. When one of the forward companies made some sort of contact with a German element, perhaps a patrol, it simply broke. Almost as if the men were acting with some sort of hive mind or collective intelligence. Without orders from anyone, they all simply grabbed their equipment and began withdrawing. Seeing its sister company retreating, the other elements of the battalion perimeter fell back to keep contact. With everyone withdrawing, panic spread like wildfire. When these 2 forward companies reached the battalion reserve, they were no longer withdrawing, they were fleeing. The urge to run and save oneself was contagious, and soon the whole battalion was routing. As the fleeing mob screamed past the battalion command post at the village, the staff officers desperately tried to impose some order. Eventually, they were able to deploy a new defensive line running through the village, but they could only stop about 70 men from their panicky flight. There was also a tank destroyer platoon in Vossenack supporting the battalion that morning. This unit did not withdraw with the infantry. It reported no German activity in the area. The 2nd Battalion was never attacked, but its badly neglected men could simply endure no more. It had been routed by the German artillery fire alone. It must be remembered that, unlike the highly trained divisions that took part in the Normandy campaign, men who had been preparing for that operation for months or even years, in late 1944, a large portion of the 28th Infantry's men were replacements. A weakness of the American replacement system, these men were generally deployed to the front straight out of basic training. It was assumed that the field formations themselves would be able to train these replacements, but in the rush of a high-intensity war, there was often simply not enough time to adequately train these men before they were committed. These faults with the replacement system, issues that Cotter himself had raised with Allied command, do go quite a way to explaining the diminishing quality of many American infantry regiments in late 1944. The Germans were certainly planning an attack on Vossenac. That morning, the 156th Panzer Grenadier Regiment and some portions of the 60th Panzer Grenadiers were forming up for an attack on the village, but this was delayed, and no Germans approached Vossenac until that afternoon. Nonetheless, there was now a gaping hole in the 28th Division's position which, if properly exploited, threatened to cut the division in half. The situation was now truly desperate. It was the Division 2 IC, Brigadier General Davis, who found himself in command and on the spot. But he simply had very few resources to do anything. The only available unit was the 1171st Engineer Combat Group. The sappers had been feverishly working on improving roads and tracks when they were ordered to grab their weapons and move to Vossenac and the Col Gorge. The 146th Engineer Combat Battalion, minus one company, which was designated as a local reserve, was ordered into the line at Vossenac. The balance of the regiment, the remnants of the 20th Engineers, and 2 companies of the 134th Engineer Combat Battalion were ordered to clear the Germans out of the Col Gorge. When the sappers reached the gorge, they found that the Germans had abandoned their position and made rapid contact with the friendly units on the other side. But it was now clear that a more serious battle had to be fought in Vossenac. Exploiting the collapse, the Germans had now entered the undefended outskirts of the town, and the 156th Panzer Grenadier Regiment was planning a large-scale attack on the remaining American positions, an operation which was scheduled for the morning of the 7th. At the same time, the American engineers were planning their own attack with the aim of regaining the positions once held by the 2nd Battalion of the 112th Regiment. The Americans happened to go first. As the Germans were massing at their start line, they were hit by a heavy and concentrated artillery bombardment. Behind the cacophonous shell fire, the engineers charged. Despite lacking many typical weapons such as hand grenades or mortars, and in many cases still wearing their work boots, the sappers fought with vigour, elan, and commitment. As the 2 companies charged, they were met by the German artillery barrage, and although one company suffered dearly, they pressed on. The 2 forces met in the outskirts of Vossenac, and a bitter, close-range firefight ensued. But the Grenadiers had been battered by the lethal and accurate artillery fire, and the superior commitment of the American sappers steadily began to tell. Although the line moved back and forth several times, once the edge of the village had been taken, the Germans broke, falling back in some disorder. After a day of ferocious battle, by the early evening, the engineers had cleared the eastern end of Vossenac at a cost to the 116th Panzer Division of at least 150 casualties. The valorous sappers had undeniably rescued an utterly desperate situation, and in the process prevented disaster from becoming catastrophe. With the desperate situation at Vossenac now stabilised, the battle at Commerscheit came to its predictable climax. Although obvious and rapid success had been achieved at Schmidt, local German commanders were becoming more frustrated by the stubborn American defence of Commerscheit. Despite suffering severe casualties, the Americans were still there, clinging desperately to their ever-thinning line. On the evening of the 6th, General Bruns, the commander of the 89th Division, held a conference with his regimental leadership and the commander of the 16th Panzer Regiment. He ordered all of his available forces to make a concentrated attack the next day. Commerscheit must be recaptured. The attack materialised the next morning. Behind a heavy and accurate artillery preparation, a force of 2 infantry battalions advanced with 15 panzers in support. This was undeniably the most significant attack the American defenders had endured. By this point, the village itself was a burning wreck. Much like the regiment's position at Vossenac, at Commerscheit, the men had to endure both the endless shelling and dreadful weather. Their heroic and stubborn defence notwithstanding, many were approaching a state of mental and physical collapse. But despite these challenges, there was no repeat of the disaster at Vossenac. As the panzers rumbled down the hill towards their objective, they were met with fierce and determined resistance. From the cover of the village, the few remaining Shermans and tank destroyers engaged the approaching Germans, and American crews claimed 5 vehicles destroyed. But still the enemy came on, and a vicious, close-range firefight ensued. Unlike the prior engagements, this time the exhausted and depleted defenders were simply outmatched. By the early afternoon, German tanks and infantry had overrun the outer defences. As the Americans fell back into the village, the panzers slowly drove down Commerscheit's little streets, moving from house to house and systematically levelling each building. Something had to give. Eventually, small groups began evacuating the town, withdrawing to the tree line at the edge of the Col Gorge. By this point, Colonel Ripple, now in command, assessed the situation as irreversible. Infantry losses had been severe, and he only had 2 tank destroyers and 3 Shermans still in the fight. Aided immensely by the excellent American artillery, Colonel Ripple's small, ragged band had indeed put up one hell of a fight, but it was clear to all that Kommmerscheidt was lost. He ordered his remaining forces to evacuate the town, but lost 2 more vehicles in this maneuver. That afternoon, Cotter made a phone call to his corps commander, General Gero, informing him of the disastrous situation at Kommmerscheidt. He requested permission to withdraw all of his forces from beyond the Kull River and form a defensive line around Vossenack. After confirming with General Hodges, Gero agreed, but informed Dutch that the First Army commander was rather unhappy with the request. Hodges' acquiescence was a tacit acceptance that the First Army's right flank would now have to be anchored on the Kull River rather than the Roer, an acceptable but unsatisfactory state of affairs. Hodges noted in his diary that he was extremely disappointed by the division's showing. Cotter knew he was in trouble the next morning when he found his headquarters full of stars. That day he was visited by Generals Gero, Hodges, Bradley, and Eisenhower. The fact that the 12th Army Group Commander and Supreme Allied Commander Allied Expeditionary Forces appeared in person at a divisional headquarters was evidence of just how concerning the operational picture in the Hurtgen forest had become. Cotter knew his standing was poor when Eisenhower greeted him by saying, "Well, Dutch, it looks like you've got a bloody nose." During the meeting, Hodges pulled Cotter aside for what was later described as a sharp conference. Sensing that Hodges wished to speak with Cotter alone, Eisenhower and Bradley did not stay long. In front of the corps commander, Hodges gave Cotter a severe reprimand. The First Army leader was especially critical of the fact that Cotter did not have a clear picture of his division's dispositions, even going so far as to claim that he had lost control of the division as a whole. The generals agreed to allow the 28th Division to fall back on Vossenack and form a new defensive line there, whilst forces could be deployed to clear the Monschau corridor. After the meeting broke, Hodges ordered General Gero to examine the possibility of command changes within the division, and suggested that Cotter be immediately relieved. The Battle of Schmidt was over, and it had ended in unequivocal disaster. Schmidt was the single most costly division action fought by the United States Army in the European theatre of operations. Indeed, it was amongst the most costly of the entire war. In just 6 days of fighting, the 28th Infantry Division sustained a total of 6,184 casualties, over a third of its pre-battle strength. The hardest hit was the 112th Regiment, the unit which made the attack on Vossenack and Schmidt. The regiment lost 232 men captured, 431 missing, 719 wounded, 167 killed, and 544 non-combat casualties, a total of 2,093. It entered the battle with 3,100 men. Vehicle losses were just as catastrophic. Including damaged vehicles which had to be abandoned, the 707th Tank Battalion lost 31 of 50 M4 Sherman tanks, and the 893rd Tank Destroyer Battalion lost 16 of 24 M10 tank destroyers. The division's officers had also suffered badly. 2 of the 3 regimental commanders had been wounded. 2 battalion commanders suffered from combat fatigue and had to be replaced. A 3rd commander was badly wounded by a sniper with Task Force Ripple, and a 4th was killed in action. Losses in trucks, weasels, anti-tank guns, machine guns, mortars, and small arms were also enormous. In recompense for this terrible cost, the 28th Division had achieved meagre gains indeed. It had secured the town of Vossenack, an objective which had almost been gained by the 9th Division a month earlier. It had also expanded the left flank of the American salient by approximately 2,000 metres, gaining the tree line near the village of Hurtgen. The ratio of blood spilled to yards gained was certainly reminiscent of some of the Great War's most infamous battles. German losses were also comparatively light. During the primary phase of the battle, the 6 days between the 2nd and 8th of November, the 28th Division took 913 prisoners and inflicted an estimated 2,000 other casualties. American commanders believed they had destroyed approximately 40 German tanks. However, in a post-war interview, General von Waldenberg, the local panzer commander, stated his tank losses as 15. The second act in the Battle of the Hurtgen Forest, Schmidt, can only be described as an outstanding German victory, one that was perhaps as notable as it was unlikely. The shattered remnant of the once mighty Army Group B, now largely composed of hastily mobilized and barely trained divisions, each manned by teens, old men, and convalescents, had stopped the 28th Division in its tracks. Furthermore, and despite the overwhelming American advantage in mass and indirect fires, particularly artillery, the paltry German forces were able to outmaneuver and outfight their American opponents, precipitating a rout at both Schmidt and Vossenack. In point of fact, the 28th Infantry entered the battle with more tanks than the 116th Panzer Division. The battle was a crystalline example of just how capable the Wehrmacht still was, even in its much depleted state. Obviously, the terrain here massively favoured the defence, generating a battlefield geometry that left numerous American battalions badly exposed with insecure lines of communication, weaknesses the outnumbered Germans were able to masterfully exploit. In combination with the weather, the impact of terrain on the battle cannot be overemphasised. The forest not only prevented the easy employment of combined arms tactics, which are the cornerstone of American doctrine and what made the US Army so formidable, but it both inhibited manoeuvre and gave the Germans the artillery advantage. Despite having far fewer guns available to support the 74th Corps, the simple fact that the average German soldier was huddled in their steel, concrete, or log bunkers, whilst their American opponents were forced to manoeuvre in the open, made the propensity of artillery to airburst in the dense forest, a lethality multiplier, far more consequential for the Americans. Finally, in such constrained terrain, the Americans could no longer exploit their far superior operational mobility. But over and above the terrain, the battle was evidence, if any more was required, that the will to fight had still not left the German soldier, and despite its material weakness, the Wehrmacht was still a formidable foe. Despite his meteoric rise, Major General Dutch Cotter was lucky to have survived the battle with his career intact. Notwithstanding Hodge's clear desire to have him relieved of command, Gero spared Cotter, and Dutch led his shattered remnant of a division out of the Hurtgen forest. It was relieved by the 8th Infantry Division on the 14th, after which it was ordered to occupy a quiet sector of the front in the Ardennes where it could rest and refit. Immediately after the defeat, General Gero ordered the 5th Corps staff to conduct an analysis of the battle and determine why the 28th Division was defeated. It concluded that the fundamental plan was sound, but there were 5 primary reasons why the battle went so poorly. These were: extremely poor weather conditions, which impacted all aspects of the operation; the inadequacy of the Call Trail as the division's main line of communication; stronger enemy resistance than expected; a lack of a divisional reserve after the second day of the battle; and, finally, German artillery on the Brandenburg-Bergstein Ridge, which dominated the battlefield. It is, perhaps, rather predictable that the 5th Corps staff would conclude that the fundamental plan was sound, especially considering it largely emanated from their headquarters, along with significant input from Generals Hodges and Gero. However, a balanced evaluation of the plan reveals many flaws. Perhaps a symptom of a wider cultural aversion to concentration within the US Army, Gero and 5th Corps headquarters simply ignored the principle of the concentration of force. In essence, the 5th Corps battle plan took an American infantry division, an extremely powerful formation, and divided it into thirds. It did this by mandating the division simultaneously achieve 3 geographically distinct and widely separated objectives. Thus, instead of forming a single, powerful, coherent force, the 28th Division's 3 infantry regiments essentially fought their own distinct and disconnected battles. This hamstrung the divisional commander, as, with all of his regiments simultaneously engaged, he could not easily move forces from one area of the battle to another. Furthermore, with 3 axes of attack diverging so sharply from one another, as the regiments advanced, the gaps between them only grew, which left each vulnerable to defeat in detail, which is precisely what happened to the 112th Regiment at Schmidt. In essence, the battle plan was simply too ambitious. Hodges and Gero were trying to achieve far too much with too little, and they were disrespecting both the terrain and their enemy in the process. For example, the 2 flank operations conducted on either shoulder of the salient were arguably completely unnecessary. The 109th Regiment's advance towards the village of Hurtgen may have given the salient more width, and thus more protection from a German counterattack in this sector. But by advancing the line forward, the space between the American regiments only increased. Arguably, this flank was already well defended by the presence of the 109th Regiment, and had the line been kept shorter, perhaps one of its battalions could have been made available to strengthen the divisional reserve. But at least attacking to the north of the salient did address a realistic threat. The operations to the south were not only a pointless distraction and a waste of time, they were nothing short of a complete disaster. There was no need whatsoever to commit the 110th Regiment against the west wall defences to the south of the 28th Division's position. Although when manning the formidable west wall defences, the hodgepodge of fortress battalions and random Kampfgruppen which composed the 275th Infantry Division were more than capable of putting up a ferocious fight, their lack of personnel, mobility and heavy weapons meant these forces posed a minimal threat of counterattack. As the 9th Division had shown, as long as the American forces held a coherent line which prevented infiltration, counterattacks by the 275th Division could be contained and beaten back relatively easily. After all, when they left the safety of their bunkers, they were just as vulnerable to the lethal air-bursting artillery as their American opponents. Thus, this flank could have easily been contained by a single battalion, leaving the other two to form a divisional reserve. Instead of focusing on the operationally relevant objective, Schmidt, Hodges and Gero were looking to also achieve a breakthrough in the Monschau corridor. Again, this was a diffusion rather than a concentration of mass and combat power. By attacking these extremely formidable German defences in such difficult terrain, the 110th Regiment did little more than expend its strength pointlessly, costing hundreds of lives in the process. Furthermore, if we examine the 5 explanations for the defeat at Schmidt advanced by the 5th Corps headquarters, we can see that virtually all of them emanate from decisions made by that headquarters or the 1st Army commander. The weather was undeniably a critical factor in the battle, all but eliminating air support and having an extremely corrosive effect upon morale. But the entire reason it was fought during the first week of November was because General Hodges insisted that the attack go in no later than November the 2nd. This was, of course, because he wished to draw German attention and reserves away from the main effort, the 7th Corps attack around Stolberg. But despite the fact that this main attack was delayed substantially, Hodges insisted the 28th Division go over the top, no matter the weather conditions. As it happened, after the battle, the weather deteriorated further, but this was unknown to 1st Army leadership at the time. Indeed, Hodges' order to commence the battle stipulated that the attack was to be made regardless of the weather conditions. Cotter was also essentially forced to use the Call Trail as his main route of supply, despite its inadequacy, by the operational objectives he had been given. 5th Corps headquarters had set the 3 axes of attack, and one simply crossed the Call River and its gorge. Thus, although the trail proved to be inadequate, there was essentially no meaningful alternative. All of the major trails across the Call Gorge were single-file tracks, and using another approach would have meant disobeying Gero's directives. The next 2 explanations are expressions of the same pathology: an underestimation of the enemy and a lack of a divisional reserve after the first few days of the battle can both be clearly seen in the fundamental plan. The very reason Cotter did not have a major divisional reserve available was because he had been given 3 simultaneous objectives to meet. Clearly the plan's ambition was driven by an assumption that their German opponents were not capable of conducting a large-scale mobile defense, at least not at divisional scale, and that forces in this area were immobile and weak. Any alternate plan that took the threat of a large German counterattack seriously would have surely emphasized the maintenance of a strong divisional reserve throughout the engagement. For example, if we imagine an alternative plan that focused primarily on the capture of Schmidt, this would have given Cotter a far more balanced position. If the 2 flank operations were downgraded to demonstrations and aggressive patrolling, arguably both shoulders of the salient could have been firmly held by a single regiment. 2 battalions facing the primary axis of German counterattack from Hurtgen, and just a single battalion to contain the German west wall defences around Ravensburg. This would have given Cotter an entire regiment in reserve, a force which would have been available to support the drive on Schmidt, doubling the combat power available in the area, or meet a German counterattack anywhere in the sector with decisive force. One has to wonder how the battle at Schmidt, Kommerscheid and Vossenack would have unfolded if Cotter had 3 fresh battalions available to meet the German counterthrust. With such infantry resources available, the Call Gorge could have been far more adequately defended, giving the engineers space and time to improve the division's communications. The wretched men of the 2nd Battalion, 112th Regiment at Vossenack, poor souls who had to endure 3 days of constant artillery bombardment, could have been rotated with said divisional reserve, potentially preserving the battalion as a fighting force. Finally, had the initial advance on Schmidt been made in greater strength, say 2 battalions, this force may have been able to hold the 89th Division's counterattack, although it must be said, that the lack of crew-served anti-tank artillery was still a critical weakness. Even with the additional forces available, heavy weapons could not cross the Coal Gorge until the Coal Trail had been improved, and thus this gave the Germans a critical window of opportunity to strike the American spearhead, one they used with decisive effect. The last major flaw within the battle identified by 5th Corps headquarters was the dominant position of German artillery, both batteries and observation, on the Brandenburg-Bergstein Ridge. The effectiveness of the German guns was both an outcome of the battle plan, specifically the deployment of an infantry battalion to such an exposed position, and the inability of the American artillery or air power to conduct an effective counter-battery mission. Several post-mortems have been unable to determine exactly why the fearsome American artillery was unable to silence their numerically inferior German counterparts. The weather undoubtedly played a factor here. The effectiveness of Allied artillery was in no small part founded upon aerial observation and reconnaissance. With an airborne observer watching the fall of Allied shells, this fire could be corrected in real time, and even well-camouflaged German batteries could also be located from the air. But with low clouds and rain obscuring the battlefield, these force multipliers could not be applied. Furthermore, there is also a possibility that the substantial artillery resources available to the 28th Division were, nonetheless, thinly stretched. Fighting 3 separate regimental battles meant dispersing the available artillery fires, much of which were desperately needed to hold the line at Kommerscheid. With so much of the artillery already committed, perhaps there were simply not enough batteries available to conduct the counter-battery fire mission. Finally, although accounts of the battle do not clearly illuminate this feature, it appears as though at divisional headquarters there was not sufficient emphasis or urgency placed upon the destruction of the German artillery, which was wreaking such havoc at Vossenack. Therefore, although Major General Cotter's leadership throughout the battle was hardly perfect, he certainly did not deserve the blame that General Hodges was already heaping upon him. Although he probably did let the battle get away from him, in many cases, Dutch's hands were tied. Despite Hodges' inclination to do so, one can also not blame the divisional commander for the poor performance of several infantry battalions, including the disastrous rout at Vossenack. The division was now largely composed of thousands of barely trained replacements, and Cotter simply did not have the time to train these men effectively before his division was committed in the Hurtgen forest. There were structural and systemic problems with force generation and sustainment that Army and Army Group leadership were attempting to rectify by simply replacing local divisional command, an often futile and counterproductive action. But, as the saying goes, victory has many fathers, but defeat is an orphan, and evidently, and despite his own culpability, General Hodges was trying to make Major General Dutch Cotter the Battle of Schmidt's lone parent. But how could a man who had just performed miracles at Omaha Beach, and served with such distinction throughout the Normandy campaign, be so unfit for command of a division in the Hurtgen forest? Clearly, Hodges' scapegoating of Dutch Cotter was deeply unfair, and hardly a reasonable estimation of his ability as a battlefield general, especially when operating under a micromanaging corps commander. But, in the long roller coaster of Major General Norman Cotter's career, a military life characterized by such towering heights and profound lows, he would get another opportunity to display his many talents. As fate would have it, his battle-worn and decimated division was now heading to the quiet Ardennes sector, near a little Belgian town called Bastogne. A quiet corner of the Western Front, an area where the Keystone Division would be safe to rearm and refit. After all, the Germans had not launched a winter counter-offensive since Frederick the Great, and what harm could possibly occur in the mountainous Ardennes? Evidently, fate had yet another dramatic episode in store for the Bloody Bucket Division and Dutch Cotter. But before Hitler's last roll of the dice in the Ardennes, the major November offensive around Aachen was about to commence. Operation Queen was the largest set-piece offensive since Normandy, and the 12th Army Group was about to hurl itself against the west wall in the Stolberg corridor. Any operation around Stolberg was still vulnerable to a flank attack from the Hurtgen forest, and thus, in line with Hodges' wider offensive plan, another attack around Vossenack would have to be attempted, this time by a third fresh division. The 8th Infantry would now take its turn in the Hurtgen meat grinder. Its destination was the bloody Hurtgen Plateau, a high ground axis which had now thwarted both the 9th and 28th Divisions. In point of fact, notwithstanding the disastrous bloodbath at Schmidt, this ruinous battle was far from over, and some of the toughest fighting in the Hurtgenwald was yet to come.